welcome to Section 3 of the Fit to Respond, Fit to Retire program. This is the first section of 4, and I broke it up because a 200-slide PowerPoint would be brutal for anybody. And I think all this information is really important in understanding the context of the situation and coming up with some solutions. These are the objectives that we plan on covering within this Section 3, which is this presentation and 3 other presentations. And they're all based on understanding the fundamental problem so that we can figure out a solution together. Just a heads up, these slides in this first presentation are going to be a little bit out of order from what you can see in your book. And that was based on feedback that we got from that initial training. People wanted to see a little more of the rapport and building rapport, and so there was more focus there, and the order I thought needed to be adjusted a little bit. So the focus of this section is going to be understanding the issue within the fire service and how these 3 fundamental problems can combine to turn into almost a perfect storm in some situations if the issues aren't managed as they come. So we're going to get into these individually in greater detail, but in this initial section we're going to briefly talk about these and get into the reason. Basically, we're getting deep into the problem and trying to understand it better, and I think this is just the beginning. The other perspectives within this group of CFCs is going to be valuable moving forward, and that's why I have this section up front in the training. As we approach understanding these issues, we need to have a clear direction as we dig in to the specific nature of the issues. So we want to understand how they're affecting the firefighters and their families. And we want to know how that's also affecting the mission of the fire department. And we'll discuss this in a few slides, but I believe the metric to measure success in this program, one of the main metrics, is going to be well-being of the firefighter. And there are ways that we can measure that objectively and subjectively, and we'll discuss those a little later on. Another question is, what can the individual firefighter do? So there is obviously an element of ownership within these issues, because we all know that we're not always going to sleep, and we're going to manage high stress. It's just what we signed up for. But we also need to own the fact that there are things that we can do to optimize other parts of health and wellness that will reduce the negative impact of those things. And what can the fire department do? So this is, I think, one of the areas that we can step in as well as CFCs in coming up with some programs and building the structure of our health and wellness program to the point that each of the pillars within the program, so medical, fitness, nutrition, resiliency, and then data collection, figuring out how we can synergistically work together to come up with some resolutions and some strategies to move forward and present those to the administration. We've got a decent start. We just got to continue it and reinforce, I guess, some of these systems so that they can continue no matter who's in whatever position here in the medical division. And it's really important to consider as we move forward what's been done in the past, what has been good, what has been not so good, what has worked, what hasn't. So that's something that's important in general, but I think with the fire service and the culture, it's really important to understand the context of the situation, where we were 100 years ago, right, compared to now. Why are things different? And we'll get into that a little bit as well. With those questions in mind, we can begin to formulate an understanding. And this is a great quote by Albert Einstein. He's got a lot of amazing quotes in regard to approaching problems. And the full quote is, "The mere formulation of a problem is far more essential than its solution, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. To raise new questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination and marks real advances in science." We've come a long way, and I think that in relation to our job, that's good and bad. We can do more than we've ever been able to do, and we can go deeper in fires. If there's a problem, basically we got some tools to fix it, whether we're coming with the hazmat rig or the heavy. It's all things that we've taken on additionally to meet the needs of the community. So that's great. But on the other side of that, it creates an environment where our mental capacity is spread so thin that the stress of understanding each skill within each area of our job can be overwhelming, especially when it's piled on top of the job stress and the lack of sleep and all these other things. So that gets into the problem and some of the context there, right? So the next thing that we want to look at as we're formulating an understanding is we want to explore the nature of the problem. So that's kind of what these next three PowerPoint slide presentations are going to be getting into. We're going to dig into sleep deprivation and how it's affecting the firefighter specifically, and we're going to get into the chronic stress and then as well the exposures, physical and psychological. And then once we collect some data, and we've already begun a little bit of this, but we need to do more to address the specific problems and coming up with a intervention. We need to have specific information for our department to legitimize what we're trying to do. So then we can think up some interventions to present to the chiefs. And before we present, I think it would be pretty smart to think about the potential consequences. Obviously, weighing the pros and cons is going to be important. So you've seen this picture before, and I include it because I love the symbolism in it, and I know that I've said that before, but you think about the situation that the firefighter's in that's falling, right? Who knows what led to that, but it may have been prevented, it may not have, but that's just kind of the nature of the job. And hopefully those guys that are there to catch him have trained a little bit and prepared to catch him. And I mean, it's exactly what we're trying to do, because we know that the human psyche and the human body can only handle so much stress, so much sleep deprivation before something breaks, right? And this could be the cause of that fatigue. I mean, this firefighter could have been so fatigued he didn't understand that the roof around him was on fire until he was falling in. So situational awareness definitely comes into play when we're talking about this. So looking at this from the angle of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, they actually came out with a paper in 2007 going over the effects of sleep deprivation, and it's a great paper. It's a little bit dated. There's I guess some great updated information that you could supplement with this, and I have this paper for anyone that would like it. I'm trying to put all these papers, these studies on the P drive, but we just don't have enough space to accommodate all of them right now. So we're working on that. So basically, the paper is about 100 pages long, and I pulled out some of the things that it addressed in the beginning, as it was introducing the purpose of the paper, right, and the problem. Higher fire ground injury and that's kind of what we were just talking about with this firefighter. He may have slipped because he was fatigued, or he may have not seen the situation like he should have because of fatigue. And then decrements in mental and physical performance. So those two could be tied. And then I think the mental injury that is associated with these situations is also tied to that. And a lot of these things, as we move forward, you'll see are interconnected, and it's almost a domino effect, with fatigue being the initial domino. The impact on the individual. I just put this calculation at the top to paint a picture of the potential consequence, I guess is the good word, for not addressing the issues of sleep deprivation exposures and chronic stress. That 10 years I don't think is 100% accurate, because everybody varies in the way they manage those issues. But there's no doubt that the list below is associated with a reduction in life. If the individual firefighter is compromised by the issues listed in the previous slide, then that's going to compromise the mission of the fire department, which is, to help people. And if we don't have the cognitive ability to respond appropriately and the situational awareness to see the need and the issues, then we're not going to be able to do our job appropriately. And I think that will affect ourselves as well. That is one of the reasons I think people walk away from scenes with mental injury, because of mistakes that were made. And it's because we're setting ourselves up for failure. And this study right here, I think, is a perfect descriptor of that. And basically it's comparing sleep deprivation to being intoxicated. And it's saying that 17 to 19 hours without sleep is equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.05, and 28 hours without sleep is equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.1. And I want to be careful with this, because one of the reasons we're approaching this from a holistic perspective is that there's not one thing that's going to fix it. It's got to be little tweaks over time. And I don't want anyone to think that the 4896 isn't the best situation. And I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that as far as well-being and family time, the 4896 seems pretty good. And that's part of the overall well-being of the firefighter. So regardless of the schedule, even if it was the Kelly, we're still going to have that fatigue, and we're still going to be compromised, and we're going to need to figure out some interventions and some ways to manage this and prepare ourselves. Digging into that a little bit deeper, taking that idea of the equation, if we add stress on responding stress on no control or no sense of control, which is the more important, I guess, thing in that, and plus stress response, physiological stress response, and no recovery, then over time it's just going to produce that apathetic reaction and inability to have a well thought out response. And that's just the body trying to maintain allostasis and cope with the situation we're putting it in, the body and the psyche. So if there's no energy left for the basic fundamental life needs, if we're not getting sleep, for instance, the basic fundamental need that we haven't evolved to not need, if we're not getting that, then we're not going to have that appropriate response. And like I said, these are just examples, and I'm trying to paint a picture of what could happen. And I'm not trying to create any excuses as far as why we can act like dicks on scene. and why we can go home and treat our family bad, because there's no excuse, right? And that's the ownership side. We got into this job and we knew that it was going to be full of stress and sleep deprivation and exposures. So we got to own that and deal with these things. And this is one reason we're addressing these issues, so that we can figure out a way to do that better. The body's constantly trying to maintain balance, and the physiologic response to stress, and then the balance that comes after. So the sympathetic response and then the parasympathetic response that turns down that sympathetic response after is that mechanism of homeostasis. And if you think about blood sugar, I think that's a good example of an extreme. If you spike that blood sugar, you're going to have a rebound insulin rush into the body. And the same goes for the stress response. The higher the stress response, the higher secretion of the hormones that will help us survive, basically. Along the way, they do some damage. And the longer they're in our system, the longer the damage happens. And the more often the stress response is, the more damage. So allostasis is referring to that balance, but it's a term used to include the psychology as well as the physiology of stress. Physiological adaptation and psychological adaptation. Our bodies will do both. And if we just let the body and mind do what it wants to do, then it's going to throw up those coping mechanisms that may necessarily be good for some situations to protect us from the influx of stress and the hormones and the damaging effects of those, but it might not serve us well in regard to being a family member and being able to relate to our families and respond appropriately to situations at home. Allostasis is a term that was developed to bridge the gap between the psychologic and the physiologic. So it's taking into account homeostasis, which is the body's tendency to maintain balance physiologically, as well as the psychological state of balance. And it's an important term to understand because of the relation between the two and how directly each affects the other. So if we look at this from a holistic standpoint, psychological stressors are going to affect the fitness stressors. If the overall stress level is high, we could change that workout for the day to include maybe just some stretching and cardio, depending on the situation and the goals. A lot of this information I got from a paper published by the neuroendocrinology department of the Rockefeller University in New York. So they did some studies looking at 3 specific areas of the brain and how they played major roles in the stress response. So let's go through those just briefly. The amygdala, that's going to be the emotional perception, fear, anxiety, reactory part of the brain. And I would say the response, or the thoughtful response, comes from the prefrontal cortex, which is going to be the decision making, the working memory, top-down control of impulse behavior. So that's the difference between response and react. And hippocampus is going to give context to each, and it's also responsible for the down-regulation of the stress response. So the brain determines the health-damaging or health-promoting behaviors that result from an appraisal made from a stressful experience, and it regulates peripheral allodynamic control systems that feed back to the brain to affect functional and structural neuroplasticity. So that's the adaptation discussed in the previous slide, and we're going to get a little bit more into that now. This slide is expounding on that previous slide and explaining how the past shapes how we're going to manage stress and adaptation in the future. And it starts with where we grow up, how we grow up, our parents, how they manage stress, how they taught us to manage stress or didn't, that how we figured out how to do it by ourselves. And then major life events that happen. So in regard to our job, it could be the stress of responding to a scene where we feel like maybe there was nothing that we could do, and we leave with maybe some post-traumatic injury. And from that, the brain tries to figure out how next time to lessen the chance of that happening. And that's adaptation. And if it's not managed maybe appropriately and addressed, then that adaptation could either be positive or negative. And if it's not managed, then it is added to the overall allostatic load. So getting a little bit more into the neuroplasticity. So that's the capacity of neurons and the neural networks in the brain to change their connections and behavior in response to new information. And those changes happen, and they're both functional and structural. Functional could be building up resilience if we have a process that's healthy maybe. The functional change could also be a maladaptation, which would be emotional numbing. And then structurally, it changes as well. Without taking time for some mindfulness and reflection and introspection, then that gray matter in our brain it's been proven to shrink with that. And the opposite happens when we take time for some mindfulness practice. They've proven that it increases the gray matter density inside of our brains. It's not really up for debate. It's proven, and it used to be something that was looked maybe at as a hippie's way of managing life, or that it's not for me, but it's a proven method to increase the well-being of yourself and the people around you. Allostatic adaptation. All right, this is getting into a little bit more of the specific issues that arise if we don't manage stress appropriately and take that time to recover. So those primary hormones of the stress response, the glucocorticoids and the catecholamines, are good, like we discussed, when we're in an emergency, but they also have damaging effects, and they're good for the short burst of survival mode, but they exact a cost, and they increase that allostatic load. And if we don't take time to step away and recover, then you could see what happens on the right here. So if you look at the top, you're just looking at the stress response and then recovery, right? And then the bottom, the middle actually, middle left is going to be the repeated hits over time and the normal response over time. And then you get the lack of recovery in the next middle right waveform there, and you start to lose the ability to respond appropriately. Allostatic overload is when we push too hard for too long with no recovery. And the terms that you see below allostatic overload, those are basically the same thing. They're not exactly the same thing, but the results are all the same, right? And that's pushing too hard for too long, whether it's physiologic stress or strain or psychologic stress or strain. I wanted to include the different types of stress because it's important to illustrate the point that it's not just one thing that puts us over the edge. It's all of these combined. So if we're overtraining in the gym and we're not managing the psychological stress from the calls, and we're not sleeping, which falls into physical and psychological. And we start to do a little downward spiral into these other stressors that are added on top of that stress. And then we have the psychosocial stress of the culture, of the public expectations, the administration expectations, our family, getting home off shift when we have nothing left to give psychologically and physically. And then I think that puts us in a psychospiritual stress situation when we question, why did we even get into this job? Or maybe not consciously, but subconsciously. That I think that question is brought up, and some of the maladaptation that happens is trying to resolve that. Important for fitness coordinators to be able to see these symptoms in other people and learn to see them in ourselves, and that takes some time to look at where we're at, do some introspection, because there's a problem with recognition. And with that study that I showed you above, associating sleep deprivation to intoxication, a lot of those people in the study said that they felt like they were 100% with 28 hours of sleep deprivation. So that's an issue. They obviously weren't 100%. So if we think that we're good to go, we're putting ourselves and other people at risk when we're really not. So we need to take some time to step away and look at where we're at. So the cognitive dysfunction that happens with chronic stress combined with sleep debt is a recipe for an issue with recognition. And then adding stimulants to compensate is putting a Band-Aid on the situation. I think we need to use caffeine when we're on duty to be able to cope, and even when we're with our family sometimes. But we need to take a break every once in a while to see where we're at without it, and to make sure that it's not becoming something that's just a negative coping mechanism, bearing some issues that are going to create bigger problems in the future. As we're going through programs, and those out there that have trained with individuals in the past, it's an opportunity to really kind of to chat about the job. And a lot of people open up when they're feeling the pain of some fitness training. So some of these things might be brought up, and I think as far as moving forward with our health and wellness program, understanding these so that we can develop the tools to create opportunities for introspection and education to create a habit of introspection, so that it becomes an intuitive part of life, so that we don't have to get to the point of burnout or causing issues within our families and the job. So compassion fatigue, I think, is one that can get to that point, and it's an adaptation, and it's part of the emotional numbing. So I don't think emotional numbing, and this is my opinion, is 100% bad. I wouldn't even call it a maladaptation. I would say that it is an appropriate response to do our job at that time. And I know that it's helped me, and in the past, after some rough calls, perform on calls that needed to be squared away on. So I think it's a requirement. I think it's one of those things that we got to own, and part of owning that emotional numbing is this compassion fatigue that can develop and overflow into patient care and then into our families' lives and affect how we respond to the people that need us the most, right? Our families, and deserve well thought out response. Compassion fatigue can lead to burnout, and that's just not managing the issues that come along with the job. So that's the emotional numbing leading to compassion fatigue, which basically just overwhelms the allostatic load till we got nothing left, and we're exhausted and we don't really care anymore. And so that gets into exhaustion and cynicism, which apparently is the first sign of learned helplessness. And they stop caring, basically, and they develop that apathy, which is just continuates that cycle of inefficacy and cynicism, and it destroys motivation, right? And that's what we're all trying to avoid. It's not easy though, and I'm not trying to act like I'm an expert in any of this and that I've figured it all out. I think it's all a process, and that's why we're trying to figure it out together here, because I have a certain perspective that may be valuable to some people, and I know that there are others within the group of our CFCs that perspectives are definitely valuable. And if we can figure out how to address these issues and be honest, with each other about the fact that, yeah, we're feeling that burnout, we're feeling that compassion fatigue, and this is how we manage it. Learned helplessness. So this is a term that was developed by a psychologist named Dr. Marty Seligman. And this guy was doing some research on dogs, and he noticed as he was shocking them for whatever reason that, I guess it was conditioning, classical conditioning is what he was doing, that some of them were getting shocked and not doing anything about it, and some of them immediately were trying their best to get out of the situation. And learned helplessness describes those dogs, and I think it was about 1/3 of the dogs that decided to do nothing. They just sat there and took the pain. That's what we're looking at with learned helplessness, and to think about that in relation to the job, it's a balance, right? So if we respond to a call and there was a mistake that was made, maladaptation from that can develop over time is the learned helplessness, which basically is telling ourselves that there was nothing we could do when maybe there was. And I'm not saying that we should accept all deaths on the job or all mistakes on the job as personal, because some of the stuff that happens we have no control over, obviously, and the balance is on the other side of learned helplessness, accepting too much responsibility, and that can be just as damaging. And sometimes that's how we get to the learned helplessness situation, and sometimes we bounce back and forth, like with all these things. It goes back to that allostatic balance and the pendulum. That same mechanism that creates allostatic balance and that protects our bodies and our minds from the constant stress of the job is that same mechanism that perpetuates addiction. So looking at it from that perspective, those surges of dopamine and serotonin over time are going to be reduced. So when we first got on the job, I think everyone can relate to this. Every call was the same response, whether it was a man down or a fire, and it was a huge sympathetic surge. Heart starts to race, and maybe you get some of that tunnel vision or the other associated sympathetic or oversympathetic surges. And then as time goes on, the mind and the body adapts to maintain that allostasis and to protect itself from the damaging effects of those catecholamines and glucocorticoids. And that lowers our, I guess, base level of those critical neurotransmitters. And you add sleep deprivation on top of that, which we've discussed, reduces your cognitive ability to reason. It also reduces your ability to resist impulse. On top of the chronic stress and the allostatic overload, the mind's going to be looking for an out and a quick coping mechanism. And substances, some of those out there seem like a good idea sometimes. And I think it's important to realize that that's one of the reasons firefighters tend that direction, and addiction is perpetuated. This is illustrating the points that we made in the previous slide. If you look at the non-dependent graph there, it's showing an appropriate adaptation, surge of catecholamines, including opioid peptides with that, as well as glucocorticoids, and then the adaptation that happens after. You do that constantly throughout time, not allowing the body to get that full recovery, then you end up looking like the dependent individual on the right, where you don't get that same response with that same stimulus, right? So you need more to create that stimulus to get that adrenaline rush. And the same is true for addiction, and that's why it becomes an issue. You look at the slide below, over time, not allowing for recovery and the down regulation of those hormones. Sometimes it takes hours for the glucocorticoids to get out of our system. The reason that this model follows the model of drug dependency almost exactly is because the body over time is going to adapt to that harmful drug in the system, and it's going to require more and more and more to get that same effect. Even though things have progressed quite a bit lately in regard to mental health, there are still some pretty negative perceptions out there, and this is a recent survey outlining some of those. There's a lot we can do in regard to this. Chief Fox and Captain Hovermel, like we've already discussed, have done a lot, and a lot of other members of the department have done a lot, and being examples of people that stand up and say, yeah, you know, that it's okay, it's part of the job, and injury's going to come. Trauma's trauma, right? And that's the point, is we got to create a culture where we can tell each other the truth. As we take steps towards improving that perception and improving that aspect of our culture, we can create an environment for building rapport and creating that trust where, you know, we're telling each other the truth, and we're really trying to genuinely understand the issues. And as we do that, we got to put ourselves aside, right? So we got to think about the individual and what's important to them and what they might like to do and what will work for them. We got to develop an understanding of cultivating motivation, because that's one thing that's going to undermine it, is just assuming that because it worked for us, that it's going to work for them. You got to be able to understand the individual and the individual's recovery. It's going to be all dependent on perception, what the individual likes to do, and building on that. Starting small if you need to, and then building up, but gauging what the individual needs and where that individual is at. And then understanding that optimal performance is determined by recovery and not how much work we put in. You're combining that knowledge with this understanding that you've developed before addressing that person, so that you can come up with a reasonable approach. We need to remember the context of the individual, the Salt Lake City firefighter, and where they may or may not have been at some point in their life. And I think it would be safe to say that at least at one point, each has been a highly driven individual, and most, I would say, are still, regardless of how we perceive them. They've most likely made attempts in the past to improve and become what is expected. Individuals have sacrificed well-being for the community, and that definitely needs to be taken into context. So what's changed? That's a question that I've been asked over time. I think it has been more in regard to the mental health side than anything else. And 130 years ago, if you think about what a fireman was required to do, it was to be a fireman, to put out fires. Literally, that was the job, right? And maybe they did some things here and there to assist the community, but generally that was the one job, and they were held back by technology, right? And as technology advances, our tendency is to say yes, to help where we can, So we've incorporated certifications on certifications to be whatever the public needs. So we're hazmat techs, we're paramedics, we're heavy rescue techs, we're Leos. We've spread out the job title to be a jack of all trades. And I don't really like admitting that or even saying that, because I think we all take pride in what we do. And I think in general, Salt Lake City, they've held on to that tradition of the core of what we do is firefighting. What's different as far as a firefighter versus the general population, and why do we address health and wellness differently? And I think it's important to understand habits and how powerful they are, and how a regular schedule affects that and a chaotic schedule affects that. I can speak from experience, being on days, obviously, being a shift worker for the 10 years previous. It's night and day difference. Just the regular sleep and the regular schedule, you can build up those habits, and it doesn't take as much effort and work. But when it comes to the chaotic schedule and the constant change and the constant fatigue, building up healthy habits is difficult. We talked about jack of all trades. Nutrition is going to be different because of the level of sleep deprivation that we're managing, and the chronic cortisol levels, which is also associated with insulin resistance, and then the recovery hormones, growth hormone and testosterone. The sleep hygiene obviously is going to be different, because we can't follow that number one recommendation of sleep specialists to make sleep regular, because it's never going to be regular. And that's one of the issues. It's equivalent to the rotating shift work, which is the worst shift, because the body never gets used to it. If it's a regular shift schedule or a graveyard, the body after a year will adapt. The chaotic schedule, the body just doesn't know how to adapt and doesn't adapt. So it just continues in the negative spiral, and other maladaptations are produced to try to cope with the fact that the body is unable to manage that sleep deprivation. And then the control, right? A lot of people in general population are in control of how much stress, for the most part, right? Everybody has events in their lives that take that away, that control. But for the most part, with their jobs, they can control what happens day to day. We don't have that ability, and sometimes we have no control. So that element, that lack of control, is definitely part of the issue and the overall stress. So motivation, and this information that I took here was from the TSAC manual originally, and it mentioned something about extrinsic motivation, which you see there is a behavior that's driven by external rewards, but it didn't get deep into the intrinsic and these other aspects that I think are really important. So we're going to go over the paper that it referenced, and the updated information that I think a lot of us need to review, and that's basically what the paper was. And amotivation is a term that I wasn't familiar with, but it's lacking the intent to act. And when you're thinking about all of these, we'll discuss here in a minute, we're all on a spectrum with multiple different things. So as CFCs, as a committee that could potentially influence administration, how do we facilitate versus undermine motivation? And the paper that I was just talking about that was referenced in the TSAC manual is this one here, is Intrinsic and Extrinsic Motivations, Classic Definitions, and New Directions. It's an excellent paper. So the self-determination theory, this is framed in terms of social and environmental factors that facilitate versus undermine intrinsic motivation. And the fact that intrinsic motivation is catalyzed rather than caused. when individuals are in conditions that conduce towards its expression. So basically, when they can have the autonomy to improve. And the cognitive evaluation theory is events and structures. So what we're trying to build, actually, and you can even think about it, an event as the TPT. And it uses the examples of rewards, communications, feedback, and that 100% fits in there. So events and structures that conduce towards feelings of competence during action can increase intrinsic motivation for that action because they allow satisfaction of the basic psychological need of competence. Something that is forced is going to produce the opposite. And what I mean by that is you think about being forced to exercise or threatened even to exercise, you're not going to get that motivation you're looking for the most part. It's going to be extrinsic, shallow, and the individual will be going through the motions. You're not going to get the results, obviously, you're looking for, and that's undermining the continuous long-term motivation. This is the demand control model, and it's getting into that autonomy and balancing the job requirements and the strain of the job with the ability to manage that strain is how I look at it. And so the autonomy is not referring to the fact that we allow people to do whatever they like or that's what we should do. It's more speaking to the point of not stepping in and creating restriction where it's not essential, number one, but also allowing for opportunities to recover and prepare for that strain. This is a continuation of that paper addressing motivation, and specifically this is talking about how we motivate through incentives. And it's saying basically any tangible reward that is dependent on performance will destroy motivation, undermine motivation. Not only that, but threats, deadlines, directives, even competition pressure, which has been considered as an approach. It might work for some, but it, for the most part, has been proven that it doesn't work for the majority. On the other hand, choice and the opportunity for self-direction appear to enhance intrinsic motivation. To foster and to develop that motivation, the individual needs to value it, obviously, and internalize it and transform it to their own. This is that motivation continuum that I was alluding to. And I think it's important to understand first where the individual is coming from before you try to come up with some suggestion. Understanding where they've been in the past, right? If they've tried a bunch of health and wellness things and have failed, then their motivation is probably going to be pretty low. And starting small is probably the best idea at that point, right? Because we don't want them to fail anymore, because that's going to continue to undermine even more that motivation that they need to build up and hopefully eventually internalize, turn it into a value-driven or interest-driven intrinsic motivation. Like we said previously, everybody's going to be in a different area of motivation with different things in their lives. The consistent education and broadening each individual's understanding of what the job is doing specifically to them that might be affecting their motivation and also might be sabotaging their goals will help them in the future create some more realistic goals and some ways to overcome those issues that have been created in the past. And that's where we can step in and come up with specific programs and tools that will increase autonomy and facilitate motivation. This section addresses the culture and the power basically behind the culture. And it says here the primary reason people are likely to be willing to or do the behaviors is that they are valued by significant others whom they feel or would like to feel connected, whether that be a family member, a peer group member, or society. This suggests that groundwork for facilitating internalization is providing a sense of belongingness. And there's no better example of that than CrossFit. Everybody wanted to be a part of that and still wants to be a part of that because of that culture and individuals within this group that set the tone for a lot of things that happen within the fire department, especially health and wellness. And I think that's why you're here, is because you want to influence that within the department. This is speaking to the power that we can have with that and building up the brand of Fit to Respond, Fit to Retire. So competence, we talked about this, integrating competence and feelings of competence and autonomy. So we got to follow up and ensure that people succeed, creating goals that are going to make that a possibility. And individualization is going to be a huge part of that. Understanding them and understanding the predicament they're in specifically, and that's what these sections are about in Section 3. So we're going to get into that. And validating by educating, and even the approach, like we said, is going to be different. And then we can empower with that education and the resources we come up with specific to the individual and the fire department. And then we can prioritize needs within groups that are going to be injured soon, or possibly are doing well and are motivated, but the idea is to be a catalyst, right? We don't want to be the motivator.
May need some help
We
in
want
regard
to
to
help them understand their
patterns
motivation
and avoiding injury.
and then we provide the
10 years down road.
opportunities to understand that and to build healthy habits and weed out those bad ones and cultivate and continue to cultivate by furthering our understanding personally so that we can provide the resources needed. And I really love this quote by Nietzsche, and it's, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." We just got to remind people of why they got into the job and why they have made efforts in the past to improve.
Thank you guys for hanging in there. I know that this presentation was not a short one, but I hope it was useful, and I'm excited to get into the specific fundamental problems in this next presentation. We'll talk to you in a bit.